So today the ds-incubator continues on the series about building Shiny applications and publishing them, which we haven't covered so much yet. We are still on a bit of a theoretical introduction, and then hopefully we'll spend more time, actually doing things. I'm excited for about at least two apps that I would like to show as examples in this meetup series. But today we're going to continue with a topic that is a little bit difficult to digest and hard also to teach for me, which is the idea of reactivity. And the reason why it's so difficult is because it's a completely different paradigm of programming than the one that we are more used to. We are used to something that is kind of more linear, so every line in a script runs in sequence. So line one defines X, line two uses X, and it's kind of straightforward. We expect that if we don't define X, but we try to use it to get an error, but if we define it first, then it's fine. So that will change with reactive programming, and it's a whole new idea that it might take some time to digest. That's why we're kind of moving slow, and even for me, it's a very interesting kind of learning experience. So let me show you my art studio here. The meetup is basically copying and pasting some chunks of code that I found the most clear and succinct ways to show the contents of a chapter that is called Basic Reactivity in the book Mastering Shiny. So the first thing that I wanted to do is to kind of start by having an overview of what we already overviewed before. So if we run, so by now you should see what's highlighted here on my screen as something familiar. It is a Shiny app. It has the typical components, a user interface that is defined here as a UI. It has a server object that is built with a function, the server function. And then it calls the two components with the function Shiny app. So if we run this thing, this application runs. What this app does is not super exciting, but we're gonna use this example across the meetup today. So basically this app is asking...
Well, we don't see anything.
Oh, shit. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. You're right, thank you.
I have the same comment.
Excellent, thanks. Let's share my screen. That explains why. Okay, do you see your pretty faces now? And now my art studio.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I was trying to show you the highlighted text and hoping that you would find this familiar. These three components, or two components of a Shiny application: the user interface, here defined as UI, and the server object, here defined, like typically as you do it with the function, with the server function. And then you call the two things. So you call the server function that you created and the UI with Shiny app, and that will trigger the app that I have already triggered somehow here. Yeah. So the app is kind of simple, a little boring, but it will be helpful for the rest of the meetup. It's asking me what's my name, and as I type my name, let's do capital M and wait a little bit. The M appears there. A-U-R-O. So I think this is intuitive, this idea of reactivity, that I do something as a user on the web browser. Actually, I could pop up this on the web browser to make it even more so the experience of a user. And as I type something, right, the application reacts and exposes the result on the screen of the user. And this is quite different to what we are used to when we program in the traditional script paradigm. Why? Because the things that a script runs only once, right? So you run the script, you define X contains the letter uppercase M, and then the output is going to be M, right? If you want it to be MA or MAURO, you have to rerun the script every time. And that's not what happens with reactive programming, and that's a little bit what we're going to be kind of showing a little bit. But before we get there, I did like the way in which Hadley in his book broke down the server function. So the start of last meetup was the UI component, but today it's going to be the server function. So before, to kind of unpack reactivity a little by little, he starts explaining about the, what you can do or you cannot do with the different arguments of the server function. And he, in this part, focuses on the input and output only, and then the session is going to be covered later on, which is fair enough because this chapter is already kind of huge just by talking about a part of the server function. So like a little overview, I think, hopefully you're familiar with this. We already know that in the UI we define some inputs and we create some placeholders for outputs. Each of those have IDs. So in this case, the name ID is an input. So we see it defined here in the UI at the top, and then we use the value that the user passes to that input in the server function. And then the output, it also has an ID. In this case, it's called greeting. And then what we do is we kind of build the output object that is defined by Shiny inside the server function using that exact ID. So at the top we created a placeholder for greeting, and now here in the server function we assign the value that we get from pasting the hello string to the input that the user gives, and then wrapping it into this render function that we're going to be talking about in a moment. Okay. So first, let's see very common errors that pop up when we start with Shiny, and that's something I did like from Hadley's approach to teaching this. So what I'm going to be first showing here is we're going to be focusing on here on the server function, right? But we do need a little bit of a UI to make this useful to see if it works or if it doesn't. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to define this, I'm going to call library Shiny. I'm going to define this UI, which is a simple numeric input that I'm calling there. And then here I'm doing something, I'm attempting to do something, which is I'm trying to change the so to begin with, the UI defined this use the ID count, right? So the user could have a place where they can pass a value to count, and by default it starts with the value 100, right? So say that inside the server function I wanted to change the value of count to 10. Can I do that? Yes or no? Okay. So this is to show one of the properties of the input argument to the server function. So inputs are read-only, so you cannot assign anything to them. And the reason is because Shiny considers that the ultimate source of truth is the browser. So whatever the user gives, whatever input the user gives in the browser. So if you would be able to change those inputs inside your application as a programmer, then it could get really messy. So let's try and run that. It should throw the error that you see here at the bottom. So let's run this thing, and maybe because I have a window open somewhere. Okay, here we got the error message that I was expecting. So this is the reproducible example that Shiny Hadley showed, and effectively we do get this message that says can't modify a read-only reactive value count. So hopefully exposing you to this error message now will, remind you when you see this error. Okay, I'm familiar with this error. I think I saw it before. What's going on? And hopefully you will understand that. You will be able to interpret the error better. It's quite clear, but at the same time, if you haven't encountered this error before and understood why it happens, it might be difficult to kind of really debug. So the point here is the one explained here at the top. So basically, the input objects to the server function are only able to be read, and you cannot write into them. So that's the first message to take about the input. The second message is that not only they are picky about they can only be read, but also they have to be read in a specific context, which is called a reactive context. So let's experience that a little bit. So remember that let's go back to the example that did work. remember that, I mean, the key of the thing is this line here, 11, right? So where we paste the hello string to the input that the user gave me. But notice how we wrap that into this render function. So that is the function that defines that context that is special in Shiny and that allows its magic to kind of flourish. So without that render function, you get an error, right? So it's not only that it is read-only, but also it has to be read within a reactive context. So that means that if I try to run the code here in line 42, where I have my server function and it is using the input that the user gave me, the input $count, it is using it in a normal function, in the function message. It is not using it in a reactive context. So then what I expect is to fail because those inputs can only be read in a reactive context. So let's see if that does happen. The error message that we expect is the one here at the bottom. And there you go. It says that you can't access a reactive value count outside of a reactive consumer. The word consumer now is a little bit pretty confusing because we haven't talked about this yet, but when we talk about what's called the reactive graph, where we're going to give new names to inputs, outputs, and something that goes in the middle, which are the reactive expressions. So basically, the long story made short is that an input consumes the input that the user gives, and that's why inputs are also called consumers. Outputs are also called producers because they produce the output. And then reactives are both things, something that goes in the middle, a little bit of a consumer and a little bit of a producer. We'll probably explore that if we have time later today. Okay, so second then error message with which I hope that you will be familiar is this idea that if you see something about that you are working inside, you need to wrap something inside reactive. That's exactly what you need to do. You need to find a reactive function that does the action that you want, or just call the reactive function itself. There's different reactive functions, not just one. And then you must use the render function. Okay, so is this the... Okay, so here I got lost for a moment because I completely changed from talking about inputs to now talking about outputs, and I didn't leave a note to myself reminding me of that. So what I showed you before, the idea that inputs are read-only and inputs must be read within a reactive context, that was all referred to, again, inputs. And now let's move on to talk about outputs. So outputs are very similar. They also have particular ways in which you have to use them, otherwise you get an error. So same thing. So for example, if you want to assign, so you can assign values to outputs, but only if you are using, you're doing that within a render function. A render does some things, including this idea of creating a reactive context for the action to happen. So let's try to run this. So the error here is I'm not wrapping the line 58 in any function, in any reactive function. To refresh your mind, let's go up. So this is what I should do. So if I'm going to assign anything to output $greeting, it has to be through a render function, right? And if I try to do that, so before we were doing something similar but to the input, now we're doing it to the output. So if you do that, you will again get this error that says, well, this works. I read it from here, from the reprex, that that basically is prompting us to use a render function, right? Because outputs must be used within a render function. And then the idea of reading that we discussed with inputs also applies to outputs. So let's stop this up here to the right because it's not doing what I want fast enough. Output, same thing, and with this we're going to be finishing about these error messages. So if you want to use an output directly outside, if you want to read an output. Like here, with the function, in this case, message, you also get an error because the outputs cannot be read, right? So this is the error message that you get. Okay, these are probably the most common error messages that you could experience. So hopefully this will, bring you back to the meetup or back to the book to try the bug, what's going on. And the bug in Shiny, I think Constanza said already, is difficult enough. So having a vague idea of what are the most common problems, I hope it will be helpful. So now we are gonna get into a little bit of what are the properties of reactive functions and why the paradigm of reactive programming is different to what we are used to. But before we do that, I acknowledge that we are 20 past, so it's also a good time to stop and ask for comments or questions now, and then use the rest of the time as much as we have to cover the rest of the meetup. Otherwise, I will move some content for next time. So questions and answers and comments. Monica, I see your hand.
Well, yeah, to me, when I look at it, I kind of relate it to building websites, and that it's basically listening to, that it's listening to the user input or output. Only if you build websites, you can actually hard code some things, and here it's kind of no, you have to use this kind of listening objects that will, have some kind of timer and check every, second or two if something changed in the variable. It's something like that, I guess, right?
I agree. Actually, I'm not sure if we're going to have time to cover it today, but certainly there are some functions in Shiny that allow you to control the frequency, how often you tell Shiny to check for inputs, and it can be as frequent as, say, you can set a millisecond and the thing will change continuously as if it was an animation, or it could be on demand. You can give a button where the user clicks there and the action actually happens. So certainly, I think that's how I interpret it, except that I do not have experience in building websites outside of the Shiny framework. So maybe if, like Jackson, I think you also have experience, or anyone else who has experience in building websites can extend the comment. Alex, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, one thing to keep a note of, especially when writing reactive, but more generally whenever you're writing any of the UI functions, reactive functions are pretty much continuously they're just always running over and over and over again. So don't make that function as small as possible, as simple as possible, just to check if you actually need to do data manipulation, so that you're not just always doing the data manipulation and slowing everything down. I've made that mistake in the past where I had a UI function that had something as simple as dply or filter in it, and when I switched it over to a static list and just pre-compiled the list, my whole site sped up noticeably. So make the reactive stuff especially as simple as you possibly can, and put as much as possible into the server side stuff.
Thanks, Alex. I think many of us kind of learn the thing the hard way. In Shiny, more than other practices in R, in other frameworks in R, where you do things, there's a lot. So exactly as Alex is saying, I'm learning that one thing that is totally fine to do in the server function, and it will only happen on demand when it's needed, because it's a lazy framework that we're going to be talking about in a second. If you do the same thing in the UI or outside the app, you get in trouble. So yeah, and there is also good resources for that. And you remind me, I think there is a talk by Joe Jeng in the 2019 RStudio Conf, where he talks about basically building performant and production-ready apps. And a lot of that is just being aware of how Shiny works and where you're supposed to do things and where not to do things, because the exact same app can underperform like terribly. Any other comment in the room? Okay, then I'm gonna move back to the content. We still have 5 minutes. I think I can cover a few more things here. I think this is kind of a little bit to be in awe about, just to go, wow, what's going on here with reactivity, and try kind of start reflecting about how different this paradigm is compared to just running vanilla scripts that we are used to. So you saw in the app before that there was, within the server function, there was a little, these 3 lines basically, where we assign greeting to output. We wrap that, so what we assigned was wrapped into the render function, and we were pasting a string to the user's input. So I kind of like how he explains it. So naturally, we could read this in our mental model that we bring from building scripts. We could read this as, okay, I understand what's going on. Basically, we're taking the string hello, and then we're pasting it to the input that the user gives me, and that's it. So that's almost there, but not quite, because reactive programming, it's because that statement, if that was what's going on here, if we're just taking the string and pasting it to the input in the same way that we're used to in scripting, then that would run only once. So as soon as I type, the M of my name, that would run, and then the output would be M, and then the AURO would never pop up on the screen, right? So there must be something else going on. So what is going on is that we are no longer giving or asking Shiny to do things for us explicitly as we normally do in scripts, where we say, hey, take the string hello, take the input, paste them together, and give me the output. No, we now give Shiny a recipe. We are not giving an explicit instruction that is imperative. Instead, we are giving a declarative instruction. We are saying, hey, whenever I need a sandwich, here's the recipe and here's how you can do it. But I'm not asking you to make a sandwich right now. So you will figure out when I'm hungry and let you know, and then you build me a sandwich, right? So that's how the paradigm differs. That the execution time is not the same as we are used to when we run normal scripts. So that's that bit there. And one interesting property actually of the framework is its laziness, and I think that is where the comment that Alex made relates to this meetup, is that precisely if you leverage the power of Shiny's laziness, you can save a lot of computation, because the computation is gonna happen only when you need it and not every time. So to express that, we are gonna see a very common mistake actually. So let's start. So this example has a problem, and I'm gonna show how that problem is a silent problem and does not throw an error, which hopefully will do 2 things. One, illustrate this idea of laziness, and so that you can leverage that power when you need it, so that you don't recompute things that don't need to be recomputed, but also to illustrate this common problem that Shiny has, that the laziness kind of sometimes backfires and makes your app behave in ways that you don't expect, and it's difficult to debug because you don't get errors. So to begin with, let's actually run this functional app. So this app runs just fine. We are assigning, so we get the name, we get, and then we assign the input to an object called greeting with double E, like greeting, and that just should work. If I execute that, let's demonstrate, hopefully if that happens in a timely manner. And there is the app. So it has the space to type my name, and it has the output, right? So it works as I expect. But now see what happens if I overwrite the good server function with a bad server function, where I, instead of assigning to greeting, I assign to grxx thing. So it's not gonna be an error, and the reason, so let's run that and see what happens. And that will be the end of the meetup, so we have maybe 1 more minute ahead. And here is the app. Now, I still have this, I mean, the app is running, it's working, but if I type my name here, I don't see the output anywhere. And the reason is that that is not an error. I don't get an error message because Shiny is not even running this code. Why? Because Shiny is watching for updates to the name input, right? And then only when that is changed, it's gonna go look for an object that is called greeting, but there is no output that has the, sorry, it's called grxx thing, but there is no output that that has that ID. So it just doesn't run that. It just doesn't throw an error because it's not doing anything there. So we are not seeing the output, right? So okay, so that is the kind of the backfire of laziness. That one must be aware. So that means, like, long story short, if you ever see your app not showing outputs that you expect, then go and check the IDs. What I do is I press Ctrl-Alt-K on RStudio, and that highlights everything that contains the exact same string. So in this case, this one here, Ctrl-Alt-K, as you can see, it doesn't highlight anything else. So obviously there is a problem in that, in how I typed that. Okay, so that is all I could cover today. We're gonna show a little bit about reactive graph and a few other things next time we meet. For now, that's the end. Any departing comment or question? Good. I think I promise it's gonna get more exciting when Jackson and Olga start showing cool apps and when we actually start building useful apps. But for now, we are still a little bit behind the core in theory. Thanks a lot, everyone. I'll be in touch with you to see if we have any meetup next week, and if so, what it's going to be about.
Thanks, Manuel.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks.